First and foremost, thank you so much for joining us here at Netroots. It's really a special space to be in today. The times are changing rapidly, and to be in community with the progressive community matters very dearly to us. I'm Sahad Baba. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm a news producer and publisher, and the executive director of the media nonprofit organization Just Vision. We're a team of Palestinian, Israeli, and North and South American filmmakers, journalists, and human rights advocates, and we have a laser-sharp focus on filling a media gap on Israel-Palestine. I'll be your moderator for today. We have an extraordinary lineup of 5 speakers joining me to discuss what I think is one of the most pressing issues of our times, Palestine. Today, after 10 months of horror, including Hamas's attack on October 7th, followed by Israel's assault on Gaza, nearly 1.9 million Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip have been internally displaced, and nearly 40,000 Palestinians killed, the vast majority whom are civilians, including women and children. Despite ceasefire resolutions from the UN Security Council, mass protests around the globe, and pleas from the families of Israeli hostages to prioritize a hostage deal, the Israeli government, backed, funded, and armed by the United States, has been intent on continuing to pursue the destruction of Gaza and its people. Today, we're here to discuss the widespread dissent that has emerged in response, certainly around the world, and importantly, in the United States, where so much of our policymaking is fueling this war. We're also here to discuss the backlash and repression those who are speaking up are facing today, and what this means for our collective progressive movements. I'm joined by Fadi Abu Shamala, a journalist and outreach associate at my team at Just Vision, Simone Zimmerman, director of communications, strategic communications and outreach at Diaspora Alliance and co-founder of If Not Now, Sabia Ahmed, staff attorney at Palestine Legal, Laura Friedman, researcher and president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and Vince Warren, executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. For the first 50 minutes or so of this conversation, I'm going to be guiding this conversation with a few questions to our panelists to get us started. And then we're going to go ahead and open up the conversation to a Q&A guided by your curiosities. My phenomenal colleague, Alex Gertz, who is in the green and pink and white outfit in the back waving, has note cards. To keep us moving, if you're interested in submitting a question for the panel to discuss, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand during the conversation. She will bring over a note card to you. You can write your question down, hand it back to her, and we'll make sure that we filter them up here. Does that sound like a plan, everyone? All right, so let's get started. So much of the organizing that we're seeing on Palestine, as I mentioned earlier, is a response to the growing concern among the American public about what's happening in Gaza. It's important to begin that conversation in Gaza, in my belief. And so we have my colleague Fadi to get us started on this. But before I turn to him, I want you all to know a few things about who he is that he probably wouldn't share otherwise. I mentioned earlier that he's with my team at Just Vision. He was actually the lead producer on our 2017 film, Naila and the Uprising, which covers the Palestinian women who helped lead the first Intifada, or the first Palestinian uprising of the late 1980s. Over the last 7 years, he served as our outreach associate. And in the first few weeks early on in the war, Fadi became quite vocal, making American and international television appearances. As the threat to Palestinian journalists in Gaza became evident, with so many of the massacres happening to people, to families, in their homes at night, killing entire families in one swoop, Fadi started to sleep outside of his house, down the road in his car, for fear that his home would be targeted at night, and his parents, wife, and 3 kids would be killed. They ultimately had to make the very difficult decision to evacuate Gaza, and so just this week marks 6 months since he's been in the United States. So Fadi, you join us today having recently evacuated Gaza, but you've lived your entire life there through successive Israeli assaults. Can you set the stage for us? What has the last 10 months been like? And what's different about this time, if anything?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Swat, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Actually, in Gaza, we have been recently under 17 escalation, including 4 to 5 wars. And a lot of invasions happened before that. I don't want to be history instructor, so I will go directly to your questions, Suhad. The new thing in this genocide that the Israeli occupation started asking the Palestinian people in Gaza to displace their home. This is the first time that they are asking entire cities to evacuate from, for example, from the north to the west, to the south. That's led to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been displaced to other places inside Gaza, and to be staying in tents in inhumanity situation. This is the first time that an entire neighborhoods, full buildings, be wiped out. Like it was bombed. This is what we have. What I was seeing by myself, like the whole building in one bomb. That include tens of people. They bombed these houses in the night while people are sleeping. So no one knows that he is killed. They go to sleep, the kids go to sleep, and they never wake up. This is the first time that thousands of Palestinians are still under rubbles. We know nothing about them. We are sure that they are killed. Number says about average 10,000, but we don't have accurate numbers till now. We will know that the day next of the ending of the war, hopefully. This is the first time that for months Israel controlled every tiny goods to be entering Gaza, which led to a real hunger. I'm not talking about this month. It happened since the beginning. I evacuated from Gaza, and my family, my wife and my kids, followed me after 5 weeks. They were hungry when they arrived to me in Cairo. Very thin, very sick. This is the first time also that we are blacked out. We don't have internet. And if you remember when I tried my best to be connected while 2.3 million of the Palestinian Gaza have no signal. But we needed to keep telling the truth from the ground. But we don't have signal, cell phone signal. We still don't have internet. This is the first time that the Israeli occupation uncovered his real face when, and I'm quoting from officials. When I say officials, I mean ministers of the Israeli government. One of them called us animals. One of them called us, he said that no drop of water for the Gazan people. He said that in public. The Minister of Heritage said that we must hit them by nuclear weapon. It's nothing new, but this is the first time that they say it in public. The last thing, I would say that for the first time that we are facing in Gaza, that we are killed live. It happens, a lot of massacres happened decades ago. And sometimes we said, oh, this is justified. The media is controlled by X and Y and Z. But now, at the time of the social media, we are broadcasting the massacres, we are broadcasting the genocide, while the international community are still silent. This is also ridiculous, and I cannot actually, and also the Palestinians in Gaza cannot understand that's why the international community are still silent. Thank you.
Thanks, Fadi. I actually want to follow up on that. You just spoke about the role that Palestinians on the ground are playing in broadcasting what's happening, and how in many ways, that information is just a click away for all of the people that are sitting in this room to be able to see and access it. It's no surprise to me that journalists in contexts like this are actually classified and given the same protections under international law as human rights defenders. They're also the ones who are bearing witness, documenting abuses, collecting evidence of war crimes, and in many ways, an origin point of dissent. Over the last 10 months, 108 journalists have been killed in Israel-Palestine based on information collected by the Committee to Protect Journalists, 2 Israeli journalists, 3 Lebanese journalists, and 103 Palestinian journalists. The CPJ, or Committee to Protect Journalists, have identified this period as the deadliest for journalists since they began collecting data in 1992, noting that the Israeli military killed more journalists in Gaza during the first 4 weeks of the assault on Gaza than any other army since it has began its work almost 40 years ago. Fadi, can you share a little bit about what is the role of journalists in Gaza and who's actually able to report from there right now?
Thank you, Suad, for this question. As a journalist, and I spent my entire life, and I don't know what to say. Unfortunately, I evacuated. I'm always still feel guilty that I left Gaza and left my colleagues behind me. But journalists are facing many obstacles in their work. Actually, and journalists will understand me if we have journalists here. We have been trained about safety. We know what is the procedure to be safe and while you are covering the stories in a place that has a war. But it's unusual for us at all because those procedures cannot protect us from bombing. Those procedures cannot protect our families from being targeted and killed. Actually, the journalists are systematically targeted. And I also wanted to hint to you, Shireen Abu Akleh, the very famous Al Jazeera journalists, have been killed in front of the cameras. So this is something that's systematic, that the Israeli occupation are targeting the journalists themselves. The second point that we are facing in Gaza, that the journalist himself or herself has to make the balance between 2 main things. The first thing, when we are displacing, actually I displaced from my home in Gaza City to Khan Yunis City, but the majority of the journalists have to flee and displace their houses many times, from the north to the Gaza City, from Gaza City to the middle area, from middle area to Khan Yunis, then to Rafah, then now to Khan Yunis. And every time we are displacing, we have to make the balance between what should we fill our car's truck, the food, or, for example, the camera charger, or the stuff of the journalist. So for us, the camera is like the food, but my kids need the foods more than the camera. But telling the truth about what is happening in Gaza to all over the world make me need to have the camera in my car, not the food. It's horrible to make the decision while you have to make this decision. And in a few seconds, there's a bombing happening, and you have to make this decision. You have to, you have all your stuff. And a lot of my friends told me that at the end, we decided to take our stuff, the journalism stuff, our cameras, our batteries, our charger, our tripod. The second thing is the Palestinian journalists in Gaza bore the burden of telling the truth alone. Because in this war, and actually in the war of 2021, Israel prevented the international journalists to enter Gaza. And it's not easy. Usually, having international journalists make us take some rest. And we have also international evidence of the crime that's happening. Because if you don't believe us, okay, there is the Washington Post correspondent, for example. And I used to work with tens of these international newspapers. So that make us work like 3 shifts a day to keep covering what is happening on the ground, and it wasn't enough. We need thousands of cameras, thousands of journalists to be in Gaza. And I can understand that, like what happened, like the wars, because of the wars before 2021, that led to for Israel to be like in some courts. And those courts have been accompanied with the international journalists' evidences. So Israel, starting from 2021 war, kept preventing the international journalists to enter Gaza.
Thanks, Fadi. I want to come to the role of the global community, right? If Palestinian journalists are bearing the burden of telling the story, part of what we're relying on here is the idea that international communities right here, are hearing those stories, but not only hearing those stories, taking action on behalf of communities that are being bombarded, assaulted, and living under a genocide. And so I want to turn to Simone. We've actually seen some incredible organizing globally, from London to Istanbul, from Jakarta to Sao Paulo, from Cape Town to Berlin. As an organizer who has been involved over the years in a lot of different capacities, can you share more about your reflections on this moment of organizing that we're seeing right now?
Yes. Is this on? Great. The first thing I just want to say is that, like, it's a real honor to be able to sit here with you, and it's also maddening that we've had to see this level of horrors for the movement to be where it's at today. And I think all of us are kind of holding that at the same time right now, right? So this is absolutely a watershed moment, and it is built on decades of organizing, of storytelling, of resisting erasure, first of all, from Palestinians on the ground across historic Palestine and in the diaspora, and also in Jewish communities. And also, you know, what's so profound, I think, about this moment is that, you know, everything Fadi just described is Palestinians are live streaming this to the world, and it's completely shattering all of the myths of, you know, Western morality, and it's bypassing all of the traditional mediums of storytelling, right? We know this. It's the first live stream genocide. And I think what that's doing is providing this incredibly, you know, powerful lens through which, as I already just said, these myths are being shattered. You know, the myth of the Israeli army being the most moral army in the world, the myth of, you know, Western governments, foreign policy being dictated on a commitment to human rights. I mean, I'm just thinking about this week that we saw, you know, these statements from President Biden and other U.S. officials, you know, lamenting the killing of children at a Ukrainian hospital. And I mean, it's complete upside down land, right, when it comes to the Israelis bombing hospitals in Gaza. And we're all living through that tension every single day. And what that's doing is bringing, I think, so many more people into the movement who are then also seeing their own struggles through the lens of the Palestinian struggle. You know, questions about racism and policing at home, questions about international law and the international legal order. And then I want to talk about a little bit what that means in the US context, which is that, you know, we then have a majority of Democratic voters supporting a ceasefire. We also have a majority, by the way, of Jewish Americans who, you know, in a poll that was released just this past month, over 50% of US Jews support the US cutting, stopping sending weapons to Israel over its invasion of Rafah, which is pretty staggering considering the fact that over and over again, one of the most enduring myths that we hear, particularly in this country, is the idea that all of this is being done in the name of Jewish safety. President Biden continues to say, without Israel, there's not a Jew in the world who is safe. And, you know, first of all, like, as a Jewish person, I have to say, like, how offended I am by that idea that my safety requires committing a genocide of another people across the world. But more than that, the numbers don't back it up. The movements don't back it up. We are seeing, you know, tens of thousands of American Jews in this movement for a ceasefire. We're seeing the polling, and I I think, obviously, I think one of the questions of this conference is, what is it going to take for, our politics to actually catch up with the will of public opinion? But that's where we are right now, in this like breaking tension between where the majority of people are at and where our politics are.
Simone, thanks for that. I want to bring Sabia into the conversation. Sabia, you and your team at Palestine Legal in many ways are at the center of the battle of dissent on campuses. You're also often in touch with some of the organizations that are on the front lines of movement building and driving the protest movement currently that we're seeing. And you just released a report called Reverberations on since October 7th. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend all the folks out here to check out Palestine Legal's website. I'd love for you to just share at a high level, what are the organizers, what are the goals right now of many of the organizers that you're working with, and where are we seeing traction?
Thank you, Sahad. So I think I'll start with just the goals of the movement that we're seeing right now. And I think first and foremost, the goal of the movement is for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. It's for an end to this genocide. And it's for an end to US support for Israel. It's for an end of sending billions in dollars a year. It's for an end in sending weapons to Israel to commit this genocide and just uphold the apartheid system in general that exists. And it's for an end to, the apartheid in Palestine. It's a movement for Palestinian rights and dignity, I would say. It's a movement against all of these things that I named, but first and foremost, it's a movement for, in the name of Palestinian human rights and dignity. And I think it's important to frame it that way also. And I'll say, we work a lot with students. So in the university and campus context, one other thing we see students calling for is for their schools to divest as well. So it's not only about the US government stopping sending this money overseas to Israel, it's also about universities that are complicit in this genocide as well. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot in the news with encampments, students across, I think it's like 39 states in the US have set up encampments all over the country. We saw this pop up in the spring. And just that's one of the trends that we've been seeing recently is that escalation. But I also just want to say the moment that we're in right now, it's bringing people into the movement like never before. So in November, we saw in Washington, D.C., there was the March on Washington for Palestine, which drew in an estimated 300,000 people. That's the largest protest for Palestine in U.S. history. So we're seeing this movement growing. And I think that's a really inspiring thing just to keep in mind as we move forward in all of this. And then, there's protests that we see on campuses. There's these larger movements like the one in Washington. But then we also have other kinds of civil disobedience and local actions. For example, we saw in the Bay Area this year in January, over 3,000 community members came together to disrupt the entirety of the Oakland port operations. And in just that one day alone, they lost $12 million in revenue. So that's the equivalent of almost what we send to Israel in a day. So we see people coming out in these really creative ways for Palestine. And I think also I just want to name that these creative actions that we're seeing are not just born of this movement. These are actions that we've seen from our organizers. Now we're learning from organizers of the past decades of the civil rights movement, of Vietnam anti-war protests. This is all using similar tactics that we've seen from that era. And the last thing I'll say is this is not just Palestinians who are protesting for Palestine. And I think that's already obvious for the folks who have been out there. But it's everyone. It's black and brown communities. As Simone said, it's Jewish Americans. Everyone is part of this movement, and I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Sabia, thank you. We often reflect on our team and in my organizing circles around the fact that out of the horrors of what's happening on the ground, that it's incumbent on those of us who have the privilege to exist in the world with relative freedom to organize. And it's been incredible to see so many people seeing themselves in what's happening in Palestine and organizing and doing just that. The conundrum that we're facing is that despite all of the organizing, our political leaders have failed to catch up to where the communities on the ground are, where the people are. And there are forces that are very interested in shutting down the conversation. And that's coming fast and furious. And so I want to get Lara Friedman in here. Lara, you are both an expert, an incredible researcher, and many of us in the trenches, in whatever hats we wear, have relied on the resources and the documentation that you've produced with your team at Foundation for Middle East Peace. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the incredible tables that Lara puts together, please do check out lawfare.fmep.org. It's a website that tracks the campaign to exploit US laws and courts to squash American activism for Palestinian rights. And when you talk about this, you often talk about Palestine being the tip of the spear. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Sure. And actually, I want to take a step back a little bit. I don't know if the word lawfare has come up much today, but I feel like it'd be useful to just unpack it. When I speak about lawfare, people probably mean different things. When I speak about lawfare, I'm talking specifically about this variety of practices and policies that try to use the laws and courts to quash criticism and activism around Israel-Palestine. And to be clear, there have been efforts in this vein forever, certainly as long as I've been alive. That's nothing new, particularly on campus. And our colleagues at CCR and Palestine Legal can talk about years of defending free speech and right to protest there. But what we've seen over the past decade or so has been really a sea change, right? And you have this ecosystem of actors who are targeting organizations that are involved in criticizing Israeli actions or policies, defending Palestinian rights. And it's an ecosystem that is well-financed, politically well-connected. This isn't some conspiratorial thing. They're very clear about what they're doing. They're very proud of what they're doing. And it includes non-governmental organizations, individuals and private sector groups, US elected officials, and it also includes Israeli actors, including Israeli government actors and Israeli non-governmental actors that are closely aligned with or directly working with the government of Israel. And what we've seen is these lawfare actors have been systematically and very effectively developing and testing new tactics, honing new strategies, and seeking to shape laws and a regulatory environment that advances what is often an explicitly declared goal of delegitimizing, suppressing, chilling, and even criminalizing free speech and activism that is critical of Israel, its policies, or that advances Palestinian identity, calls for Palestinian rights, calls for justice, etc. And we're talking here really tangibly about state laws, about federal laws. Everybody knows about the anti-boycott laws, Just Vision's great movie, Boycott. We're talking about laws that are seeking to impose and enforce a new definition of anti-Semitism, which if you listen to the people who are behind that definition of anti-Semitism, don't listen to me, they will tell you the special sauce, the value added of that definition is that it centers the fight against criticism of Israel and assertions of Palestinian rights and identity. They're very, very clear on that. And going back to what Simone said, none of this is about Jewish safety, right? The special sauce, the added value of this definition called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition isn't that it helps secure Jewish safety. It's that it helps prevent criticism and protest of Israel. And of course, post-October 7th, this is now on steroids, particularly targeting protest and free speech around campus, but also beyond. And I think it's important to say when we talk about the tip of the spear, as I said at the beginning, these efforts have been going on for years, and they've been targeting Palestinians, Palestinian voices, Palestinian organizations. I have said for years, you may not give a crap about Palestinians and Palestinian rights. You should, but you may not. But this issue is coming for you, and it's coming for your rights. So if you saw the movie Boycott, you saw in part of that movie the idea that, hey, we can repurpose these laws to go after, investing, the whole idea that there should be accountability in investing. We can repurpose these laws we've seen in reality in the past couple of years to go after not just ESG, but CRT. We can use it to go after abortion and trans rights. We basically have a template that can be repurposed for pretty much anything you want. We have legislation that was passed in the House, and there was a lot of groundswell after it finally got some attention, that pretty much was seeking, in the name of fighting anti-Semitism and terrorism, to give a single official in the US government the ability to buy fiat, basically strip away the nonprofit status of organizations and say they're aligned with terrorism. This is not about protecting against terrorism. They were very clear in the hearings. This was about shutting down SJP. But that tool could be used against everybody, and that's why the ACLU came out so strongly against it. And more recently, we're seeing in Congress what is just the absolute new McCarthyism, new Red Scare, hearings around targeting higher education, the raft of lawsuits that have been filed on Title VI, this is higher education and elementary schools, basically claiming that the mere presence of voices talking about Palestinian rights, the mere presence of a Palestinian flag, the mere presence of the phrase Free Palestine, not to mention River to the Sea, is hateful, dangerous anti-Semitism that must be quashed. And we're looking in Congress, again, there have been introduced a raft of legislation, none of which has passed so far, but some of it may, that would actually seek to narrow the very idea of free speech in order to prevent those things. And by the way, this week we saw a hearing around unions. So if you feel strongly about unions, we're going after unions now because unions are calling for ceasefire, and that's anti-Semitism that must be stopped. So when we talk about the tip of the spear, that spear has been going through the metaphorical bodies of Palestine activists and Palestinian voices for years. And you should have cared about that, we all should have. But now it's going all the way through, and it's hitting pretty much every other issue that people at this conference care about. And another thing I just want to say, just to add, sorry, my last thing, is this is maybe the issue, this is the whole intersectional. Some people hate that term, intersectional. This is very intersectional. Palestine is probably going to come up at almost every meeting in this event for the next couple of days, because it does touch on everything. But it's also intersectional in another really painful way, which is that this is bipartisan. Most of the issues talked about at this conference are partisan. This is bipartisan. For whatever reason, we have, the Palestine exception of old. For folks who aren't aware of what that is you can be progressive in everything but Palestine and still call yourself a progressive. The Palestine exception means that all the things I'm talking about in lawfare generally have bipartisan support. And to be perfectly honest, I said this to Sahad before the event, and I haven't said it in a microphone before. What is actually terrifying to me when I see some of the breaks coming in Congress on the worst stuff, it's not coming from progressives. It's coming from conservatives who say, wait a minute, that anti-Semitism bill, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, we oppose it because we think it's a form of DEI. So we're not going to let it happen, because if we let that anti-Semitism bill, which is meant to take away my free speech on Palestine, if we let it pass, it's a model that can be used to quash conservative speech as well. And by the way, they're not wrong. It is a model. But it's a model that anyone who cares about free speech, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, should be standing up and opposing.
Laura, thank you. Always figures out how to pack it all in under 5 minutes, which is magical to me. But I want to go to Sabia and have Vince close us out. But before I do that, I'm going to come back to Simone. Because I'm trying to organize all of you, I'm going to just put in a plug. Again, if you have a question, if anything's surfacing for you, please flag my colleague, Alex Gers. We do have note cards. We want you to write those questions down so we can bring them into the discussion. All right. So coming back to you, Simone, to kind of bounce off of what Laura just shared, you've been thinking a lot about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. You've been thinking a lot about the role of anti-Semitism in progressive movements and the risk it poses. Can you unpack it for us?
Sure. So I'm going to just give a little bit more color to some of what Laura just talked about, which is to start with a little story, which is that at one of these hearings in the House Education and Workforce Committee, Republican Congresswoman Virginia Foxx opened up the hearing in which the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn were, humiliated. But she opens the hearing by talking about how universities themselves are hotbeds of anti-Semitism. And the examples that she used of where anti-Semitism on the university campus is coming from included courses about racism and colonialism, period. So already off the bat, we understand what this is about, right? This is about attacking the teaching of critical history, not just on Palestine, but about this country and the bloody history of this country. So as Laura said again, it's the spear is going through all of us. An interesting story that came out recently is that many of the Republican congresspeople who were at that hearing actually had talking points and research supplied to them by an organization that coordinates very closely with an Israeli government ministry, the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, which is headed by this guy named Amichai Chikli, who is a racist and a homophobe. And also this week was very publicly criticized by Emmanuel Macron for actually very publicly supporting Marine Le Pen in the French election. So again, what we're talking about here is not a conspiracy, but a global right-wing alliance. They're very open and proud about it, right? He said it will be good for Israel if Le Pen wins. And this group, which again, the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, they claim their role is about protecting Jewish people around the world and connecting us with Israel. And they're using it to advance this right-wing authoritarian agenda. And it's an agenda that has found a lot of common cause with the GOP in this country, which is why it's so incredibly frustrating that we've had so many Democrats, liberals play along with this playbook. I feel like I should also mention right now that, this is an Israeli government ministry or an Israeli government that has, not only overseen the destruction of every single university in Gaza, but also is overseeing an incredibly repressive crackdown on its own citizens, teachers, scholars, who, even dare to speak at all, exercise any empathy in public for Palestinians. And so that's what all of this is really about. It's about changing the topic away from all of those things onto this conversation about anti-Semitism. And none of this protects Jewish people. And I want to say, again, this has found, this agenda of protecting Jewish students on college campuses, which is what these hearings were about. First of all, I was at Columbia's campus. I got to spend Shabbat and Passover with the Jewish students who are in the Gaza Solidarity Encampment. Of course, when we hear conversations in the media about protecting Jewish students, it's never about protecting anti-Zionist Jewish students. It's never about protecting any students who've participated in Palestine advocacy. I'm going to let the other folks on this panel talk more about what that crackdown on them has looked like. But I also just want to say about anti-Semitism itself, which is that it relies on these conspiratorial ideas about Jewish power, about these nefarious, schemes happening behind the scenes. That's what anti-Semitism traditionally is at its core. And what it does is it isolates Jews and sets them up to be a special protected class. And it's taken different forms throughout history, but that's one of the common themes of how anti-Semitism has worked. And so very explicitly, I want to say that the way that this whole, battle is playing out on college campuses of isolating Jews, lifting us up as this special group, as the scapegoat, as the face for these broader repressive policies that these right-wing politicians and movements want to roll in anyways. Increased policing, silencing of dissent, silencing of teaching of critical history, using Jews as the scapegoat for all of that also endangers us. It doesn't help fight anti-Semitism, and it doesn't actually keep our community any safer, which is why it's also important that progressives understand anti-Semitism and understand that fighting anti-Semitism and fighting for Palestinian freedom are not in contradiction.
Thank you, Simone. So I want to turn to both Sabia and Vince, who are involved in and part of teams that are at the forefront of defending many of the students, the employees, the organizations who are coming under attack by the lawfare efforts and the smears that Lara and Simone so carefully kind of laid out for us. Sabia, as I mentioned earlier, your team is really kind of at the forefront of the campus conversation. Can you share with us what you're seeing in terms of the way repression is playing out on campuses and the work that Palestine Legal is doing to protect the right to dissent, particularly around Title VI?
Thanks, Sohad. Yes, so students and activists since October 7th have been coming out in full force, as I've mentioned a little bit just earlier. In the fall, we saw mass protests, die-ins, teach-ins, other kinds of civil disobedience that students have used on campuses, and activists, off campus as well. And then in the spring, most recently, we saw that escalate to encampments and sit-ins on campuses. And I do want to highlight, Sohad mentioned earlier about our report. So we have this report that came out just last month called Reverberations of October 7th, which highlights these trends from October 7th through the end of the year, December 31st. And lays out just the different kinds of ways we've seen this in campus, on workplaces, even in the K through 12 context, for example. So, there's that on our website. I would encourage you all to go look at that if you're interested in learning more. And so the encampments that we've seen on these campuses, as I mentioned, they happened across 39 states and DC, 100 campuses or more that these encampments were happening on. And what the students who are part of these encampments have encountered is a coordinated repressive assault with their universities who collaborate with local, state, and campus police. Those police have come in, have arrested students, have brutalized students, and faculty, just whoever is a part of the encampment is subject to this kind of police brutality. And we've seen school administrators call in law enforcement to arrest over 3,000 students, professors, and solidarity activists on more than 80 campuses across the country. And at Emory, for example, which is a school that I've worked with, we saw Atlanta Police and Georgia State Patrol being called in to assist with the Emory campus police. And as part of their response, they put, tear gas into the crowd, pepper balls, and they also, threw a professor onto the ground. They tased a black medic who was already on the ground, who was already in handcuffs. But this is the kind of brutality that we're seeing on these campuses. And what's really appalling is the fact that the universities are the ones who are sanctioning this violence against their own students. And I want to take it back to where this all stems from is anti-Palestinian racism. And Palestinians and those who are associated with them, those who are advocating for them, they are being systematically discriminated against, dehumanized, smeared as violent, they're censored, they're doxed. This is a phenomenon that mirrors Israel's racist oppression of Palestinians living in Palestine. We're seeing something very similar happen here, but in a complete, different context. And we're seeing SJPs, Students for Justice in Palestine groups, getting banned. We're seeing them getting banned or dechartered completely. We're seeing students being charged with student disciplinary processes, different conduct violations with little to no due process. And I'd like to highlight one story of a student I had at a public school in New York University who had taken banners from a window, like an office window, that said, "We stand with Israel." And as a result of that action, the school recommended that he be expelled for that. And what actually happened after he took the banners from the window is that the staff person whose office it was attacked him. And the student didn't fight back, but he was attacked by a staff member. And until after that, I didn't hear of any consequences for this staff person. I don't know if anything has happened till this day. But this student was recommended for expulsion. Thankfully, we were able to support him through that process. He was ultimately suspended for a semester and then given probation for a year after. But students who don't have any kind of representation, they're being they're being faced with these sorts of charges at their own schools. So, I just want to say that, like, the last thing, Suhad, you mentioned Title VI, which is one other way that Palestine Legal has been supporting students. Title VI is a federal law. It's called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it prohibits universities from discriminating against their own students on the basis of like race and national origin. And we've seen, as Simone, I think you mentioned, like Lara, a lot of these Title VI complaints being lodged for things like saying from the river to the sea or free Palestine. But on the other end, Palestine Legal has been helping students to file these types of complaints for universities discriminating against Palestinian students. And so at Columbia, at Emory, for example, at UMass and UNC, we have now opened federal investigations. The government has opened investigations into these schools for the types of repression and discrimination that these schools are exhibiting against their students. So I'll leave it there for now, but just wanted to give a highlight of the different examples.
Thanks so much, Sabia. We're going to open this up to Q&A in just a second, but I want to get Vince in here. Vince, your team has worked on a range of issues over the last several decades. You've also chosen to center Palestine in your work and recently brought a case against the Biden administration on charges of genocide. Can you tell me why Palestine is so central in your work at CCR?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Suhad. How's everybody doing okay? You don't sound like people who love justice to me. How y'all doing? Okay. Thank you for this wonderful, wonderful panel. It's an honor to be here. And so why does the Center for Constitutional Rights do work on Palestine? We've been doing work on Palestine for about 30 years. We've sued Israeli officials for human rights violations. We've sued US corporations for human rights violations. And as Suhad mentioned, we just sued the Biden administration. But the why is because I'll speak for myself, not for the organization. As a black man growing up in America, I understand what it is like to be criminalized. I understand what it is like to have the state apparatus pushed against you, to have dominant narratives that only center around the worst moments of my life, the world that I was left as a black person, where black people just don't get any of the benefits. And I used to think that it was just a question of discrimination and unfairness, but it is not. It is by design. It is by design because anytime, the thing that I have learned, which is reflected by the panel here, anytime that you want to oppress a vulnerable community, or if you want to make a community vulnerable, which is probably a better way to put it, the best way for the state to do that is to criminalize the people in that community. And then when those of us rise up and say, this is some fucked up shit, we can't let this happen, then the next thing they do is they criminalize the people that come to their aid. And if you think about it, this is the US playbook for 400 years. It is also the same playbook that's happening in Ukraine and in Russia. It's the same playbook that's happening in Israel. Netanyahu and Putin are actually saying the same things in terms of justification for what they're doing. We're in here, gosh, I wish we didn't have to use all these bombs, but there are all these little terrorists that are embedded in the civilian population, so we need to be able to do that. And what is so disgusting, and it was wonderfully brought out by Simone, what's so disgusting about our politic in the United States is that with the exact same narrative, we can have two very different views about what US aid should look like. We can have two, and conflicting. So on the one hand, everyone should mourn and be outraged by bombings of schools, but not more so in the Ukraine than in Gaza. On the other hand, flipping it, that the conservatives in this country really don't want to give money to the Ukrainians, but they do want to give money to Israel. And so it's also a question of how we sort of, how the national debate conceptualize the idea of the aggressor and the victim. And what's happening in Palestine is that it is clear to us that the victim are the Palestinians, and it is clear to a lot of the people in power here that the victim is Israel. And we make this mistake all the time, and it's a narrative mistake, but I think it's also important to note here, is that when the narrative is that Israel has the right to resist, I understand that narrative. But we have to be clear that states don't have rights. States have power. And people have rights. So when we're talking about who has the right to exist, and we're not talking about the Palestinians in the middle of an unfolding genocide, it's very clear to me that those of us who are now rising up and in solidarity and really do not want to allow to write a blank check for this administration to be complicit in genocide, that is a part of the narrative flow that we're fighting against. The Center for Constitutional Rights I also want to just let some folks know, as alluded to, that there is a huge attack on Palestinian human rights groups, both in Palestine as well as here in the United States. We're representing a number of folks. We're representing the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights against a frivolous lawsuit filed by the Jewish National Front, where they're saying all kinds of outlandish allegations that say that collective activism and solidarity equals some sort of unlawful activity, which, by the way, is the exact same narrative that the state attorney general of Georgia is using against the Stop Cop City folks. If you look at that complaint, it's essentially talking about collective action and solidarity as conspiratorial acts of criminality. So this is the playbook that we have here, and applying it specifically for Palestinian support, I would say this, that with apologies, I'm a huge Star Wars nerd. It's embarrassing. It's actually embarrassing. But for those of you who are with me, you know that the first movie that came out from the Star Wars saga was A New Hope, and you also know that the second one was what? The Empire Strikes Back. And so part of our piece here, and I know Simone was saying that it's really sad that things had to get so bad for us to act, and I totally agree, but there's another way of looking at that. And the other way of looking at that, what would it look like if things were this bad and we didn't act? That's right. And we didn't have this amount of solidarity. This room didn't exist a year ago. I've been coming to Netroots for a long, long time. And we are now in this moment where people are stepping in and we're stepping up, but we also cannot afford to be disheartened by the fact that the empire is and will continue to strike back. That is actually how we're tested. That's how our resolve is tested. When Sabia was talking about the foundations for this movement moment that we're having now, and she mentioned it, but I want to be super specific. Thank you, Black Lives Matter.
That's right.
Okay, because I've been in the work for a while, and it's 10 years since Michael Brown was murdered, and that this type of movement activity, particularly one where oppressed groups step up and take leadership, and then solidaristic groups come in, hasn't been seen since the 1960s. So the moment that we're in now is a moment of complete movement power. Do not get it twisted. They will have hearings. They will arrest some of us. They will kill some of us. They will jail some of us. They will try to restrict our ability to fight back. They will tell us the upside down world, but that's how we know that we are winning and we're being effective. And we cannot use this opportunity to kowtow to a fear of being labeled as anti-Semitic. We know what we're about. And last thing I'm gonna say, because I don't get into questions, but I'm all fired up, y'all.
Keep it coming.
But in the context of the protests that we've been seeing, and you've all seen this too, but let me just name it, right? First of all, I led the divestment and protest movements way back in the day around South Africa, and we did the same fucking shit that people are doing right now. Nobody was trying to label us as violent. Nobody was, I mean, they called the cops sometimes, but it wasn't the same type of thing that was happening. So we've actually seen this moment before. This is what people do when they stand up, and that the state violent apparatus that is a necessary component of criminalizing those of us who are in solidarity. This is very much what it looks like. I will sort of stop there, but say that the lawsuit that we have filed against the Biden administration, also Anthony Blinken, and also the Secretary of Defense, is a case under the Genocide Convention, which the United States is a signatory to. And we have expert witnesses. We have Palestinian plaintiffs, some who are currently in Gaza, some who have escaped Gaza, some who have family in Gaza and live in the United States. And in the hearing that we recently had this year, it was the first time in American history that Palestinians were able to testify in court about what is happening to them. And despite that, the United States government said this case should be dismissed on what's called a political question doctrine, which is basically that if the courts were to make the decision about the U.S. role in supporting an unfolding genocide in Israel, it would amount to foreign policy, and that's the purview of the executive and not the judicial branch, so case dismissed. But it raises the question, it's a legal question, but I think it's a question for us to consider here, which is, if the Genocide Convention that the United States has signed on to as a legal document cannot be enforced in federal courts by us, by Palestinians, who can enforce it? Supreme Court just came out with a ruling that says, I got good news, President Trump. I take that back because I'm nonpartisan. I got good news, executive branch. You are going to be held. You're going to be presumed to be immune from acts committed as long as we're in the lawful course of your business. In your position. And so the question for you is, if the president wanted to commit a genocide, or aid and abet a genocide, or support a genocide, or any of those things, would the president be immune in this country? Thank you.
Ooh. And that's why Vince Warren closes a panel. Vince mentioned that a room like this didn't exist at Netroots in previous years. For the folks who are live streaming, I just want to make sure that you all see this room or hear about this room. This room is a full room. It's a beautiful, diverse, incredible room. And so thank you all for being with us. Thank you for the questions you've submitted. Thank you for the folks who are tuning in via live stream as well. We have a few minutes left, so I'm going to do my best to power through as many of these questions as we can. One piece that I want to pose for the panel is this question about, that's coming up in a lot of different ways in these cards, is this question about, okay, so we're at a gridlock, so to speak, right? People power is moving, we have mass mobilization, and yet our political leaders are failing to catch up. What do we do next?
The way that the question has been asked as what is already done is nothing, or like a simple thing. So usually when someone asks me what should we do, I will ask them the same. Because what we have now, like as Vince said, like this full room, it wouldn't be happening like years ago. But when someone asks me what to do, usually I answered him to do this. What I love to say is talk, educate, boycott, advocate. This is the fourth thing that I usually ask people to do. So if you are in the train, just ask someone, did you know what had happened today in Palestine? Just ask him one question and leave him. Don't make an argument. Just make the people think about what is, just to keep digging about what is happening in Palestine. To educate, if you have kids, if you have friends, colleagues, neighbors, whatever. If you have got knowledge about what is happening in Palestine, please educate them about what is happening. Boycott. I love the one who invented the idea of boycotting because it's a very peaceful way to punish someone who's doing something against your belief. You are not fighting him, you are not arguing with him, but I'm not buying your goods. That's it. And trust me, it worked. And it's very successful tools to do. And the last thing is to advocate. Whoever around you, your senates, congresspeople, councils, members, whatever, as long as you have time and energy, do it and advocate for the not only for the Palestine issue, but for every issue that you believe in your heart. Thank you.
Thanks, Fadi.
I'll add to that, Fadi. I would say also, of these politicians and the people who you're speaking to and expecting more from, continue to expect more, demand more. Don't settle for, whatever they're giving you, however they are now, for the bare minimum. Continue to demand more of the politicians that you are pushing on, that you might be in conversation with. And the other thing is in your organizing efforts, for those of you who are in the streets or in protests, et cetera, in organizing spaces, if you're in the Palestine movement space, to connect with or continue to connect with people who are not in that movement space, but who are in other movement spaces, bring people into the cause. We talked here about how there's intersectionality, as Lara was saying, between these different movements, and there's so much to learn from each other. And for those who are in other movement spaces who are not directly connected into the Palestine movement, to look into that, become a part of the movement, join it, and learn more about it.
No, I'm going to jump in here with moderator's privilege, and I've been working on this issue now for 20 years. In many ways, it runs in my bloodstream. My father's generation were fighting for their rights before me, and before that, his grandfather, and my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles. So this has been a long struggle. And in the 20 years that I've been working on this diligently, with Just Vision and beyond, one of the things, if you were to look at polling, Simone talked about polling earlier, if you were to look at polling of American public opinion on what is happening in Palestine today, 20 years ago, it was widely the case that the American public supported the state of Israel, actually overwhelmingly, just 20 years ago. In the last couple of years, that has shifted incrementally over the 20 years, but radically, where we're now seeing those who identify with the Democratic Party or identify as progressives increasingly, and for the first time in the last couple of years, supporting Palestinian rights as a majority for the first time. We say at Just Vision, I say as an organizer, as a thinker, that change moves slow until it moves fast. We are now moving fast, but we can't take it for granted. The movement we've won, the ground we've won, can easily be taken from us, and there is clearly so much more work that we need to do to get our political leaders into alignment with where our communities are. And so that means that we have to keep pushing. That we have to keep doing what we're already doing and upping the ante, as Sabia said, demanding more of our leaders. While also, I also think it's really important to identify where are things going right. Where are we winning? And Sabia spoke a little bit about that. We're seeing a groundswell across the country, across the globe. And as Vince so, I think, beautifully shared, when you can't win a debate, you shut it down. So let's keep winning, because we are winning that debate. I want to bring this over to Lara and Vince in case there's any additional thoughts about what next, what can we do?
I'll just weigh in generally. I mean, look, if you're in this room, you're already engaged, right? That's why you're here. But I want to say, thinking about Israel-Palestine, thinking about Palestinian rights, whether you're Palestinian or not, you need to recognize that your rights are in play. Engage as if your rights are under threat, because they are. Engage boldly and broadly and relentlessly. The most powerful message I've seen on social media over and over since October 7th has been, I'm sorry if my talking about Palestine bothers you, your silence bothers me, right? And just keeping this up, I joke, I have a bag of Palestine stickers that I carry. Some of you have met me because I've been handing them out to people who seem to be interested. people realizing that everybody is interested in this. When I have these stickers out and people come and say, oh, you have Palestine stickers, they're not people who I would identify necessarily as maybe caring, and now they're going to have a Palestine sticker on their backpack, and people are going to ask them. They're going to ask them about their keychain, they're going to ask them about their keffiyeh. It is about changing the perception in this country in a way that is undeniable. And it is about being relentlessly a pain in the ass of the people who want to pretend this doesn't matter. And it's not a partisan issue. It's about being a pain in the ass of the people whose offices are continuing as if it's situation normal. If you look at what Congress has done since October 7th, you would not know there's been a genocide. If you were from Mars and you saw what Congress has done since October 7th, you would not know Palestinians were dying. And that is wrong. And the antidote to that is not, there's no silver bullet, but it starts with a community, a nation of people saying, hell no, this isn't acceptable. And it's not just lobbying the people who already agree with you, it's lobbying everybody. And it's making noise, and it's having the bumper stickers on your cars, and it's having the signs in your windows that send an absolutely undeniable message across leaders of our communities that this shall not pass, and we will not allow rights to be trampled this way for the Palestinians or for anyone.
Yeah, and just to take a page out of your book, Lara, so just imagine the same Martians that are here. And they were here in 2016. And in 2016, they said, oh my gosh, this population in the United States is totally against bans. There's a Muslim ban that's happening, and look at all the people that are protesting. And they're totally against shutting down borders because the president at the time was shutting down the borders. And look at all the people that are protesting. And they're totally against building walls along the borders. And then they come back and they look at what the United States is supporting now with respect to its support of Israel, and it is supporting bans, borders, and walls. And this goes to that progressive question. And I think what folks can and should do is to have a longer view of what our politic is and to be really clear about what we are for and what we are against, and make the explanation part have to be done by the people in power. Very often they will tell you that you were wrong, that you're misguided, that you're this, that, and the other thing, and then you're like, well, what I had meant was, but we need to flip that. If you are against bans, borders, and walls at any point in this country's history, then you need to be against bans, borders, and walls everywhere, including in Israel and Palestine.
Thank you for that. I realized that I didn't actually explain what Diaspora Alliance was, and neither did Simone. So as we're starting to wrap up, I want to make sure we get that in. Simone, can you share what Diaspora Alliance does?
Sure. Yeah, we're an organization that helps fight anti-Semitism from a progressive lens and are part of the very colorful ecosystem of the Jewish left. And there's many other people in this conference representing that movement.
Awesome. Thank you. This is from a student who's been involved in organizing encampments across in Southern California. And the question is, as we see the movement and the student movement growing in popular sentiment, has there been any material outcomes? Data-wise, are we moving that needle? Can I actually turn this over to Sabia for you to kick us off?
Sure.
I think that's a great question in terms of how do we know whether we're moving the needle? Is there data to show that? That's the question. I think the way that I try to think of this in terms of, how do we know that we're winning? How do we know that anything is happening? Is by looking at the state of the movement today versus years ago, but also versus October 7th and pre-October 7th, and how the kinds of oppression that we saw on campus in the fall, for example, versus what we're seeing in the spring, it has definitely escalated. But despite that, the movement continues to grow. So I think, that's one way to understand, are we moving the needle anywhere? Are we actually winning anything? The answer is yes. Is there data that shows that right now? I don't know. If I can give you straight numbers right now on what kind of data we see that says that, but you can just look to campuses, you can look to students who are organizing right now, And the fact that they're not going anywhere, that instead of, dispersing after student conduct charges were brought against them for participating in die-ins in the fall, instead of dispersing, they came back and said, no, we're going to sit here and occupy this campus building, and we're going to occupy the lawn of our school. I think that says even more to where this movement is headed and how much it is winning.
Thanks, Sabia. Vince, I want to bring this back to you. This is a question about dehumanization and empire and how that leads to genocidal violence over time. And I think, one of the things you've talked about with, and I think that's important about the case your team has brought around the Biden administration, is that, in many ways, the dehumanization of Palestinians is an ongoing continuum that leads to repression and that leads to kind of a cycle of what we're seeing in terms of Palestinians being oppressed and ultimately experiencing genocide. And so can you speak a little bit, you talked about the limits of our courts, right? You've talked about, we've seen even our international legal system has moved quite slow. Laura, you talk about the courts being the last resort. I'd want to pull you both in terms of, when we're navigating as advocates, as human rights defenders, as activists, as everyday people, trying to push back against legislation, trying to bring legal cases, where is that helpful? And what are the limits of it? What's the purpose? As a movement lawyer, Vince, how do you think about this?
Yeah, and as Simone mentioned, that our politics are waiting to catch up to public opinion, and trailing far behind that is the law. And so the law is actually the least nimble tool that anybody can use. It should never be sort of front-footed unless there's no movement around it. But when you have a situation like this where there is movement around it, there can be really useful things. One thing is that when the Center for Constitutional Rights team was in Geneva in November, they wrote a white paper laying out the elements of genocide under the Genocide Convention, applying it to what we were seeing in Palestine and in Gaza specifically. And that had a very powerful galvanizing effect. It didn't change people's opinion. People know the thing that they are seeing. But what it does do is it does give people a framework, sort of an establishment framework within to work and say, look, actually, as a legal matter, that this really appears to be an unfolding genocide. And that can be very, very helpful to social movement. And the same thing with policy advocacy, and particularly around challenging bad legislation, trying to kill bad bills before they go anyplace, that those types of frameworks can be very helpful to movement. It's not the leading edge of the spear, but it is data and background that organizers can use to be able to make the points and put pressure where they need to.
Thank you. Go for it, Laura.
So I'm not a lawyer, contrary to what I seem to be in a lot of my research, which is all about laws. And I defer to the lawyers on what is a good case. I think all of us who've been involved in any kind of activism know that bad cases make for bad judgments, which make for bad precedents, which are catastrophic and self-defeating. The bottom line is, this is not going to be resolved simply in courts. Palestine Legal, CCR, others are taking specific cases to court, and they're choosing them very carefully and looking to make very specific steps forward. A lot of the work in courts is defensive, like the U.S. campaign case is just trying to use the law as rule of law, not rule by law, to defend the very existence of protest. I think, though, where there is space, and people ask me sometimes, if you go to the website that Suhad mentioned, I keep these just gigantic data sets, which are constantly updated, of legislation, state and federal. I track everything. And I don't track it because I'm obsessive. Well, I am obsessive about this, let's be honest. I do track it partly because it gives me some sense of control in a world gone mad, but I track it more because information is power, right? Things get stopped because people learn about them and say, holy crap, what the hell is that? And then somebody writes an article, and then someone else writes an article, and next thing you know, something is stalled in Congress. I mean, I don't lobby at all. I work for a foundation. We can't lobby at all. I take no positions on legislation. I don't tell people what to do. I share information. And I will tell you honestly, the feedback I get online, as many people who love this legislation use my data sets as people who don't like the legislation, because data is neutral, right? But data empowers you, and knowing what's happening, there is, I think, the sense of, for a lot of people, that what happens in Washington or happens in state capitals is so complicated and so impenetrable, and we just have to trust, and that's not true. It's not incomprehensible. You don't have to be a lawyer to read this. You don't have to be a lawyer to get an opinion about it. And if you're a constituent at the state or federal level, which every one of us is, you have the means with which to act and be listened to and to be heard.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to have Sabia briefly touch on this, and then we're going to go into closing words from our panel.
Suhad, can you just repeat what that question was?
You know what? Why don't we go to closing words, yeah? Okay. Great. So with that, you all have been incredibly thoughtful and engaged audience. I do want to give this to the panel because I think, for us, one of the hopes is that we're thinking about out of this room, as we walk out of this room, how do we keep this conversation going? It's a critical one. This isn't going away, and we're going to need all of us to keep organizing and activating. So with that, to the panel, any closing words?
Quickly, for the first time in my life, I was in U.S. last year. I just, for 1 year, I didn't realize that I would come back quickly, and there is a huge change that I'm noticing only in 1 year. That wouldn't happen without brilliant people like you who are engaging in what is going on in Gaza. I would ask you always to please keep speaking up for at least for the 71% of the killed people in Gaza now who are women and kids. Thank you so much.
I wanted to just read a brief quote from an article published this morning by Roz Siegel, who is a Jewish Israeli-American scholar of genocide and the Holocaust, who was just denied a job chairing a center about Holocaust and genocide because he is speaking out about the genocide in Gaza. And he wrote this morning, "Genocide is the culmination of a process that turns the world upside down, that frames defenseless people as dangerous enemies, violent states as innocent societies threatened by blind hatred and fanaticism, and lies as truth. Genocide, the destruction of a people and destruction of their world, finally is falsified and rationalized as heroic as righteous." And I just want to say that what we're talking about in this room is about righting a world flipped upside down. And we're seeing, the upside down world coming for all of us, threatening us all, as everyone else on this panel has so powerfully spoken about. So, what this is all about is not letting them demoralize us, not taking the bait, not letting them change the topic, fighting for genuine accountability and a world of genuine safety and freedom for all people.
I'll also read a quote as part of my closing, which is just from youth organizers in NSJP, which is National Students for Justice in Palestine, and dissenters, who have also been confronting campus-based crackdowns. They said, repression is evidence of our power. And I think that's such a great way to kind of just summarize what I've been trying to communicate, which is that, what we're seeing is evidence of the movement winning, is evidence of the movement growing. And I would just keep that quote in mind.
I failed to bring a quote. So I will just note, and I have this in an article that's coming out soon, I commented on this. I am Jewish. I come from a family where being Jewish and the Holocaust are huge parts of the identity. My grandfather was a huge Zionist. One of the things that I always heard growing up, and variations on this theme, which is you can tell the civility of a nation by how it treats its Jews. And I always heard that, and I always believed it. And for my parents, my grandparents, they believed it. And I think it's true. I think it was true. I think, though, in that quote, Jews was shorthand for the most vulnerable people. And we need to update that. It is not anti-Semitic to fight for the rights of Palestinians. It is a core Jewish value to fight for the rights of the most vulnerable. It is a human value. And the most vulnerable people in the country today are not Jewish students who are uncomfortable seeing Palestinian flags or hearing Palestinian mottos. The most vulnerable people in the world today are people who are facing genocide or being subjected to genocide, and people who are being subjected to attacks for defending it. So I leave you with that.
And I'd like to just close by thanking you. Years ago, I had a conversation with Diane Nash, who was a revolutionary organizer in the 1960s, and I got a chance to ask her a question, which was, I've always wondered why y'all would sing Negro spirituals when you were on the bus to those things. And she said, well, the reason why we sang that, because it made us less afraid. And so I want to sing this. I'm not going to sing, but I want to offer this panel and our discussions as a way to thank you for the bravery that you have undertaken to get to this point. Bravery isn't acting because you're not afraid. Bravery is acting despite the fact that you're afraid, and it happens on very personal levels. I am sure you've all had really, really difficult conversations around this, sometimes in a family context. And so thank you for risking your comfort and your networks for Palestinian rights, and thank you for building new networks around the concept of Palestinian rights.
And with that, that is a perfect place to end. We will be around, so if you want to chat, come find us. It is an exciting way and an important way to start off Netroots for all of us on day one. There are resources at the back table in case you want to sign up for email lists, pick up pamphlets, brochures, etc., and have a really, really meaningful and thoughtful conference.